and here in the United States.
All right, Mike, I apologize in Ohio. I didn't mean to keep you waiting this long. What can we do for you?
Well, thank you very much for taking my call, and
Sure.
Thank you for the dialogue, the conversation, the insight that all of you are providing.
Glad
but
you're
I
enjoying
think
it.
what you need to hear from us, as many times we're referred to as the heartland of the United States, but I think the heartland of the United States is every part of the USA. But what you need to hear is we do understand. We do know that the front can be both here in the United States and worldwide. We do know that it's going to take time. It's going to take patience. And I think everyone in the country needs to tell you now, we're ready. We will correct the problems. There are many problems that we understand. There's problems with not only the way our safety is handled at through the airports and so on, but I think you need to hear from us, we're ready, because what we're fighting for is our very way of life.
Fair enough. That's pretty well put. I'm not sure I could have said it any better. Mike, thank you. It was worth waiting for. It's 101. You're watching a new endeavor around these parts. They've dubbed this CNN Hotline. And before we go to Gary Cutley for the latest news, let me just give you the number to call. It's toll-free, and we'd like to hear from you. You know, one of the things that occurred to me walking into the studio, everybody from in Washington and New York City, people at the Pentagon, the phrase, our lives have been changed forever. I'd be interested in hearing how you think your life's going to change. What about your kids? What about your travel plans? What about your spending plans? What are you going to do when the stock market opens on Monday? It's been closed for the longest time since World War I. Our lives are going to change. It'd be interesting to start hearing perhaps from some people on how they think their lives are going to be different as a result of this awful thing that happened on Tuesday. Time now to get caught up on the latest news, and for that, here's my friend Gary Cutley. Gary?
Thanks, Jack. We're going to look first and foremost right now at the investigation which is underway. And some progress is being made, and we're happy to report that authorities are now holding a second person as a material witness in connection with the attacks. He had been held by U.S. Immigration Services. The first material witness was arrested Thursday at New York's Kennedy Airport. And the FBI says it is questioning two other people who were found at a New Jersey apartment. The address of the apartment was supplied by other people believed connected to the attacks. And at a news conference in New York City, it was revealed that the passport, stand by and listen to this, the passport of one of the suspected hijackers on that plane that flew into the towers was found blocks away from the World Trade Center crash site. Somehow the passport survived. Nobody else did, unfortunately. Rescue crews continue to dig through the remnants of the World Trade Center, still hoping to find survivors, any survivor there, but the wreckage did not yield any on Saturday. Hasn't really since Wednesday, I think. Only 159 dead have been recovered, and only some of those have been complete bodies, and nearly 5,000 are still now listed as missing. But Mayor Giuliani says he has some hope, but really it's only slight hope. He acknowledges that some survivors may yet be found. And elsewhere in New York City, the funerals have now begun. 3 top fire department officials were buried and honored on Saturday. More than 300 of the city's firefighters are among the missing. At the Pentagon, authorities say 187 people are missing and presumed dead. On Saturday, family members of the victims were brought by bus to the scene. Many brought flowers and balloons as they mourned their friends and members of their families. Well, President Bush has put out a terse order on Saturday for the men and women in uniform. Simple, quote, get ready, unquote. Here's Kelly Arena on the President's Weekend at Camp David.
Spending the weekend at the secluded presidential retreat in the Maryland mountains, President Bush huddles with his national security team and prepares the American people for war.
We're at war. There's been an act of war declared upon America by terrorists, and we will respond accordingly.
The president refuses to discuss military options, but for the first time, he specifically named suspected terrorist Osama bin Laden as a, quote, prime suspect behind Tuesday's terrorism spree. Bin Laden is believed to be hiding out in Afghanistan, with the ruling Taliban government providing him safe haven.
This act will not stand. We will find those who did it. We will smoke them out of their holes. We will get them running. And we'll bring him to justice.
When asked if those words mean President Bush is considering using ground troops to attack terrorists, aides say nothing has been ruled out. But winning this so-called war and finding the elusive bin Laden won't be easy, says a former Clinton administration official.
We're not fighting a military, we're not fighting an organized power, but we're fighting a very diffuse and shadowy organization that has links in many different parts of the world.
Knowing Americans are hungry for swift retaliation, the president uses his radio address to say a sweeping response will come in time.
You will be asked for your patience, for the conflict will not be short. You will be asked for resolve, for the conflict will not be easy. You will be asked for your strength, because the course to victory may be long.
And aides say President Bush has gained strength from his meeting Friday with more than 200 family members with loved ones still missing, believing his job is to turn their sorrow into something positive for future generations. While the American people overwhelmingly support a military response, keeping that support up will be another big challenge for the president, especially if a prolonged military attack means some U.S. troops lose their lives. Kelly Wallace, CNN, near Camp David, Maryland.
And Jack, as the president's up at Camp David with his advisors planning and plotting what to do next, an interesting fact we should revisit. This week CNN Time did its poll, found that 62% of Americans supported the idea of Congress declaring war. Well, in fact, it's done that through this resolution of support authorizing the president to take any action. Okay, hold the numbers. 62% declare war. 61%, when people were asked against whom do you declare war, 61% said, I don't know.
I don't know. Yeah.
I don't know. And yet it was interesting to hear Mike in Ohio just a minute ago in this calm, collected, thoughtful voice saying, hey, we know what the situation is. We know that the front line is here as well as abroad in Afghanistan. And that's very encouraging, I find.
Yeah, you could probably go broke underestimating the innate intelligence of the people of this country. A couple of observations. I was having dinner in a restaurant tonight. I live in New Jersey, about 15 miles west of New York City. Guy came in with his family. There were probably 50 people in the restaurant. He sat down. He called the waiter over. He said, I'd like to buy a drink for everybody in the place. And he did a toast to America. Just a very spontaneous thing. And then last night I was driving home through a little town called Little Falls in New Jersey, next town over to mine. And people had come out of stores and restaurants and bars and stuff. It was a Friday night. And they were standing on both sides of the street holding candles and singing God Bless America, and the cars were going in both directions with American flags. People were honking their horns and shouting USA. I mean, there are emotional signs of what has happened out there that I have never seen before.
There's the emotion, there is the anger, and this is something that Bush has to face, the president has to face. On the one hand, the public support is there. Every leader has to have it. On the other hand, that support of that anger can put undue pressure on the president.
Sure.
He's got to control the timeline on this, the timetable, and not be swept away by it. And as somebody said, act smart.
Now, there's one other story of exactly the opposite kind. In my town, there's a Dunkin' Donuts, and they're open 24 hours a day, and it's a town of 12,000, and people go there, particularly on the weekends. I go on Saturday morning, get a couple of donuts and a coffee, and you always see somebody you know, too. The day after this happened, I drove by and it was closed, and there was a police car sitting in the lot. They're open 24 hours a day. The kids that worked in there, they're probably in their early 20s, half a dozen of them you could look at them and assume that they might be Arabic. The rumor going around town was that they began some sort of celebration on news of what happened at the World Trade Center, and that they had put some sort of anti-American slogan in the window, and that the police had come and closed the place out of fear for their safety. And that's the rumor that spread all through the town. Turned out absolutely untrue. I stopped this morning. I asked, the cops were still in the parking lot. I said, what happened here? I said they got 150 threats in the first 2 hours after this thing happened, and we had to close the place. It turns out the kids are Indian. They're not even Arabic. And it was that rush to judgment based on appearance, that stereotyping, and it's just an ugly, nasty, horrible example of the kinds of things that can happen, but I guess shouldn't happen in this country. So the good, the bad, and the ugly is out there, and it's going to be with us, I guess, all of it in some form for a while. Ken in Texas, what's your question?
Yes, sir. I'm a native New Yorker. I was born in Queens at Wyckoff Heights Hospital. I now live in San Antonio, Texas. I spent 5.5 years in the United States Army. I just heard the commentary from John from Fort Hood.
Right.
Saying they have a tank sitting in a motor pool with no drivers.
Right.
I'm an ex-tank mechanic. I spent my time in the service. I was wondering, what about us? What about the service members that spent their time, got out, now would love to put a uniform back on? I would waive all my rights for benefits and everything just to put a uniform back on to serve my country. I have no other way to do it. I sit here helpless, and I wonder what happens to to us?
You know, I don't know the answer, Ken, but I can tell you where you might get it. If you called your congressman's office or called, you know, a local armed forces recruiting office, I don't know if down the road they'd make provision to take some of us old guys back. And I say us old guys, I wore a uniform too. They wouldn't take me back at my age. But depending on how this thing unfolds, there might be some sort of stateside duty or volunteer work that people that served in the armed forces can do. You might be able to go over there and get that tank running for Mike or Ken, whoever it was. But call your congressman's office. I'll bet he could tell you, and that would, and we'll see what happens. It may happen. Who from North Carolina? Salim. Yeah. Salim, you're on the air. What can we help you with?
Thank you very much. Just concerned that the Americans understand, we in America, that there is a holy jihad, and what we're up against in the long run as Americans is like a spiritual war. And I'm concerned that we as Americans do not understand that, for example, in a couple of years, a disgruntled Russian physicist or who needs money, or Chinese or maybe Iran, if they get nuclear technology, they don't get a small suitcase-sized nuclear bomb into one of our cities and level us to the Stone Age. So I don't mean to sound Machiavellian, but I'd much rather have more of Truman and less of Chamberlain. The Arab states are very identifiable, that support terrorism, and they use these people like surrogates and blame them and say, oh, we're not militant as them, but, you know, they give them protection.
Sure.
And so what I'm saying is this. I don't mean to sound Machiavellian, but if we don't take out their infrastructure, we would be more merciful to them. Of course, as Americans, we would say, get your women and children out of all your cities, which are very identifiable, Kabul, Tehran, Damascus, and say, get all your women and children out. In 3 days, we bomb your cities with nuclear bombs, tactical nuclear weapons, and destroy your infrastructure, set you back 200 years. Then maybe they have the fear of God to come against America again. Or should we wait for them to do that to us? That's my first question. Should we wait for them to do that to us?
What's your next
should we
question?
preempt them with superior technology and ability to deliver it? Number one. Number two, shouldn't there not be some questionable, I agree with you, like Japan in World War II was terrible, the way the Japanese were treated. Racism is horrible, and dark-skinned people should not fear, okay? And I had that happen to me the other day. That is not the point. The point is there should be some tactical profiling of Arab males that have come into this country in the past 10 years, let's say,
Wow.
and some designated profiling by the Immigration Department, the U.S. government, to determine whether or not these people should be here, because obviously someone of non-Arab descent and a male of non-Arab descent would be extremely highly unlikely that they would carry out such terrorist attacks, because this is a spiritual thing. We can say that...
I understand. Salim, I got to run. I want to pursue your mention of the holy jihad, though Harvey Kushner could tell us more about that. That's a phrase that we hear, and it's in the media, and I'm not sure I understand it. What does that mean exactly?
It's misinterpreted. Actually, jihad, or a holy war, or a holy effort, in face of saving society, Islamic society, is viewed upon as a noble deed. And in that case, everything goes. War is justified against an enemy in the protection of Islam. But clearly, within the Arabic world, particularly the interpretation of Islam, traditional Islam is a peace-loving religion, and we must be careful not to paint the broad brush of the 1.5 billion Muslims who live around the world as all looking to destroy the United States. We're taking a very narrow interpretation of the Quran. The Quran is specific. There are the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad in these hadiths, which these incendiary, stem-winding clerics misinterpret, issue fatwas. We hear bin Laden issuing fatwas, and quite frankly, technically he can't issue a fatwa. He's not a cleric. But this is the problem we have now. We're tending to throw everybody into the same pot. I would imagine, Jack, that in the upcoming months, we're going to learn a lot about Iran, about Afghanistan, about Pakistan, Turkmenistan, about that area of the world, and Islam itself. That needs to be clarified. If we're going to take on an enemy that supposedly a jihad against the United States, we're going to have to know what we're fighting. And clearly, you know, we mustn't now lessons learned in the past, certainly it's a shameful part of American history, the internment of Japanese Americans. Italian Americans as well as German Americans
Sure.
who were also attacked.
The other thing
and clearly that's not the American way. This country was not founded on those principles. But in terms of jihad, I don't know of peace-loving Muslims worldwide that support really the destruction of the West and its religions, and certainly the United States.
The other thing that I'd like to get your comments on, we'll have to put it off until a little later in the program, but what is it about American policy in the Middle East that has engendered such hatred on the part of these people? What has this country done over there to build these emotions, and what sorts of policy initiatives might be possible, starting yesterday preferably, to try to ameliorate some of this intense hatred, for want of a better way to say it? But that's for a little later in the broadcast. Jason in New Hampshire is with us, and Gary Tuckman is covering Ground Zero tonight, the site of the collapse of the World Trade Center. And Gary, Jason has a question for you. So we'll see if we can do a three-way hookup here. This is a new program. We'll try this technology out here. Jason, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Gary, are you there?
I am here, Jack.
All right, this may work. Go ahead, Jason.
I have a quick question. I really don't want to seem macabre with this, but I remember hearing on the news a couple days ago that the pile from the World Trade Center is approximately 100 feet high. And they're saying that maybe a lot of the material, the big cloud, was actually steel and concrete and gypsum and whatnot vaporizing. What's to say that didn't happen to, A, a lot of the people in the building, and two, I mean, the human body is fragile. What's to say that we haven't, the victims or the missing haven't been, well, for lack of a better way to put it, pressed into their component pieces by all the falling rubble?
Well, the sad fact, Jason, is that much of what has been found are remains. That's very sad, but it's very true. There are actually workers on the scene just behind me a few blocks carrying buckets to collect that. However, what they are hoping is that people, survivors, are in pockets, which they're referring to as voids. The 6 people who have been recovered, survivors, were found in these pockets and weren't touched by any of the rubble. They were just well below it. And that's the hope. Certainly, if they're within the rubble, that would be very hard to survive. But there's great hope that people are below all the rubble and haven't been touched by it.
All right. Jason, thank you. Gary, thank you. Let's go back for a moment to Mary Schiavo, who is a severe critic of the airline system in this country, and she brings her opinions based on a strenuous background as a Deputy Inspector General for the Department of Transportation. We were talking earlier, and I told you I wanted to ask you about this transponder that all commercial airlines carry. It's my understanding that the transponder, these guys who hijacked these planes knew what they were doing. They turned off the transponders. And the transponders, as I understand them, are the only way that air traffic controllers can identify which flights these are. So when they strayed off their flight path, which they did rather dramatically, the transponders had been turned off, and they're reduced to simply a blip on a radar screen, and the FAA has no way of knowing what that blip is. Am I somewhat in the ballpark with what those things do?
That's right. Well, Americans will remember a couple years ago, even Air Force One was reduced to a blip on the screen. You can do that for various and sundry reasons, but when you turn off the transponder, the air traffic controllers could still tell who was whom because they had been tracking the flight. But you lose things like altitude information, identification information, so they could see the blip on the screen, but they didn't have too much else to go on except the one transmission to one of the towers when one of the pilots was able to leave his comm line open.
Would it make any sense to fix these things so they couldn't be disabled? I mean, would that be of any help or not?
Well, actually, we have many things that we could do. One of the recommendations after Egypt Air, and there's a lot of misunderstanding about this, but after the Egypt Air tragedy on October 31, 1999, one of the recommendations by the NTSB was to actually install cockpit video, and that is not just static video that you recover like a black box. It's also possible to have video that is transmitted, and that recommendation will undoubtedly become a prominent one again, because then we would have had an idea, and there's a question whether between the first plane and the last one, the one in Pennsylvania, maybe even the Pentagon, we would have had enough information to know more fully what was going on.
Is this what they call real-time video?
Yes.
Is that what they prefer? Where they put a little camera in the cockpit, that just like you put a camera in the nursery to watch the baby, right?
Yes, and it's curious that the pilots had objected to that before, and over the last 4 days I have gotten many, many calls from pilots talking about things like wanting to arm themselves, etc. And now I think everyone realizes that video would actually protect the pilots and the passengers some. So that would be another thing besides the transponder. And one other thing I'm hoping that we can get good data off the cockpit voice recorder or off of at least one of these flights, because in another suicide attack on a plane, the Silk Air plane crash has been ruled a suicide. And in that case, the suicide pilot was so savvy that he pulled the fuses on the cockpit voice recorder. Now, that would give us a real indication, if that was done here, how well they had studied other tragedies and how well they were acquainted with the planes. It would really give a tremendous amount of insight. One other thing I wanted to add, and you'd mentioned about general aviation and the small planes all over the country, and the fact we have 655,000 pilots in America. It's pretty hard to track them all. Only those airports with commercial service have to have a security plan in place, a secure perimeter. Only those airports that are so designated at certain levels have to have that. There are lots of little airfields literally all over the country that have little small planes sitting on them. And it was those planes, curiously, when I was in the government, it was those small planes, you know, the Moonies, the Cessnas, the Bonanzas, sitting all over the country that the FAA perceived as their terrorist threat. They did realize that terrorists could steal planes, but for some reason the FAA thought they would steal small planes. And even though that was their worry, we really don't have a security plan in place for all these small planes all over the country. Now we see they aren't the threat. Terrorists have much bigger things in mind for those planes. And there's one other thing that's very interesting about the terrorists. We actually have a federal statute of 28 U.S.C. 16 something, and that is our list of countries which harbor terrorists. And the State Department puts the countries on that list by publishing it in the Federal Register. Afghanistan is not on that list, and that's something important that the state and that's something that the State Department will have to do, because it is that list which allows people to go after the assets of a country that harbors terrorism. So there's much to be done, even on sort of the end of putting all the ducks in a row.
All right, Mary, we've got a viewer in Illinois, Bruce, who has a question for you. Bruce, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Mary. I thought about sky marshals. What would you think of the idea of having 20-year veteran retired police officers? They'd be 45 to 55 years old, obviously with a track record that you could check as sky marshals.
Well, and not just a track record that you can check. You make an extremely important point. You know, and you probably know we did have sky marshals, but over the years the program was gutted. That was one of the security measures that I fought against ending. We used to have a couple thousand. It dwindled to something like 250, and finally it dwindled to about 30. And I and some others objected to that. And people now talk about, well, we're going to put sky marshals back on the plane. What's very important to realize, and since you've been through police training, you know this, it takes a lot of training to know when you have a shoot, no shoot situation, when it's a passenger panicking versus terrorists standing up to start a hijacking, and it is that training that is going to be crucial. I taught not that particular part of the training, but I taught legal things at the FBI Academy, and I had a chance to experience that. And the shoot, no shoot decision making you don't learn overnight. So someone like yourself who has had that kind of training would be someone who would be much more valuable to start up or to expand the program again from our dwindled number. And that's going to be the biggest problem with air marshals, getting them through either FLETC or Glencoe or Quantico and getting them this training. So air marshals aren't going to be here overnight.
All right, Mary, thanks. And Bruce, thank you for the question. What about, Harvey Kushner, the fact that all of these airplanes were less than half full? I've heard it debated as to whether or not that may have been significant. This was a Tuesday morning. There are a lot of flights that leave from the East Coast. These were all bound for California. But all of them had less than half a passenger load. Is that significant? And if so, what would it possibly mean?
Well, it's my belief, if I had to go back and trace the mindset of these hijackers, they probably knew those routes, probably even knew maybe flew them before, and knew the pattern, you know, which day is most likely to have the least amount. Clearly, if you want to, the question was how much fuel, not how many passengers you had aboard.
Right.
You know, it was a clear day, so it looks like it was selected exactly like that. I don't know if it worked out that way.
Somebody suggested that they may have bought all the seats, the hijackers, somebody could have bought all the seats so that there'd be fewer passengers to handle when you tried to physically take over the aircraft.
It could have been, you know, you could have made a lot of calls and say, hold the seats.
Sure.
I noticed that some people have mentioned that these terrorists used Travelocity.com to buy a ticket. They rented cars, and they act as if these are some Stone Age people. They're
right.
people like
They're
you
on
and
the
me, and a
internet.
lot of, right. I mean, you know, so we shouldn't be surprised. But I do think it was well orchestrated, and it might have been the luck of the draw, Jack, rather than doing something like that on that particular day.
Mary, you have a couple of thoughts on this?
I do. Actually, there was a strategic reason also for that early morning flight, and that is, as it was the first flight out, you didn't have the worry about a delay on the inbound, and obviously a large percentage of U.S. domestic flights are delayed. So by strategically selecting the first flight out, I know some people thought, well, it was the first flight because they loaded weapons on overnight. No, it was the first flight out because the timing was important. You know, because once people figured out what was going on, we did get fighters up there, scrambled to get up in the air. So the first flight of the day offered a strategic advantage to them as well. So I agree with Harvey. This was clearly extremely well planned out. And there are many other things that will certainly come out in the days ahead. For example, did they make reservations and change them? American Airlines has a very good tracking system. They literally keep book on us. They keep book on us so they can supposedly keep us happy, but they also keep very careful records of how we've changed our reservations, etc. And that will be interesting to see if they had to wait for another day or an opportune time or had changed their reservations at all.
All right, George is in North Carolina. George, I'll be right with you. But Mary, I want to ask you one other thing. I read a story, and I hope it's not true. I read a story that one of the airlines involved in this had gone to Congress to ask for some sort of legal immunity from civil prosecution lawsuits on the part of folks who died on those airplanes almost before we knew what had happened. Is that story true? And if so, where does that stand?
Well, that's on the internet and it's widely reported, and in fact there are some quotes by Senator McCain, and he's usually right on aviation issues, and he actually took the airlines to task. It's reported on the internet that it was American Airlines literally the day after it was lobbying Congress. Now, whether it was American Airlines or not, I mean, we've got a choice of two here, but that they were lobbying to have Congress declare that people injured on the ground, only those on the plane, and no one on the ground could seek any kind of accountability from that airline. That goes against literally everything that's been developed in American law to date. But what's more shocking to me, I mean, it's too early to be making those decisions right now. What's more shocking to me is before the care teams were even in place to take care of the victims, an airline was lobbying Congress to be absolved. Now, that does not bode well, and I predict there'll be a big backlash for that. That was an incredibly poor taste, and it was unbelievably crass and really did not reflect well on the aviation industry.
Yeah, all right. Harvey?
Yeah, Mary, I have a question for you. I believe that a couple of the hijackers had first-class tickets one way, was sitting in seats 1A. Our computerized system of profiling, wouldn't you think, and I believe the first-class ticket one was paid by cash or even by credit card, but shouldn't that have raised some eyebrows in a computer someplace, Mary?
Yes.
It seems to me that to me is a typical exercise in what you should look for.
In what way? I'm not sure I understand.
I think Mary understands.
He's absolutely right. He is absolutely right. Buying a one-way ticket, particularly with cash, is supposed to set off alarm bells. But unfortunately, we have a piecemeal system, and so the alarm bells that sets off usually is to reconcile the passenger to the baggage. And buying a one-way ticket, if you buy a one-way ticket with cash, it's supposed to also set you up for closer profiling. Unfortunately, the profiling that we do is very limited. You know, did you pack your own bags, etc. If you checked a bag, did you really get on the plane? Did you present the right credentials? You know, the photo driver's license, and did you use a credit card? So that should have set off alarm bells. One-way ticket cash is always supposed to gin up closer checking.
All right, fair enough. George in North Carolina, if you're real quick, what can we do for you? I'm getting behind here, and it's my first night doing this.
Well, my question is about the economic impact of if we have a long, drawn-out war. I was wondering if we were going to step up production in the textile, plastic, and the steel industry, or are we going to reward these companies that moved off to Mexico and other countries?
That's a pretty fair question. I'm not sure how that would be done. My guess is that whether the factories are located in the United States or not, that American companies will be called on first to do as much of the production that's as necessary to gear up for this as is possible. And I would guess that it would be logical that only in the event that American companies couldn't produce all that was needed would they go shop someplace else. But your question, you're referring to the fact that a lot of American companies under NAFTA have located outside the United States, and that the jobs producing these goods now are no longer American jobs, but rather foreign jobs. I don't know what to tell you, but it's a good question, and that's something that'll be debated in the weeks and months ahead. All right, Gary Kotlick's going to update us on the news, and then as soon as we get finished with the news update, we have Tom Mintier, who is in Islamabad, Pakistan, who's going to join us on this program as we move into the final half hour. Garrick, what's the latest?
Well, Jack, our focus this evening, story number one, is the ongoing investigation. Here are some of the newest developments this evening. The investigation of Tuesday's terrorist attacks. The U.S. Justice Department tells CNN that a second material witness has been brought into custody. The man was one of 25 people who were being questioned by the FBI while being held by U.S. Immigration Services. A first material witness, that's someone who's supposed to know something or someone connected with the crime itself, was arrested on Thursday. The U.S. Justice Department has also released photographs now of 8 of the suspected hijackers. The pictures include 4 from American Airlines Flight number 11. That was the first plane to hit the World Trade Center on Tuesday. There is one hijacker from United Airlines Flight 175, which hit the World Trade Center's South Tower. And then there are 3 from United Airlines Flight 93, which went down in rural Pennsylvania. New York City rescue crews continue to hunt for survivors in the rubble there at the Trade Center, even as hope is dimming. As we know, nearly 5,000 people are listed as missing somewhere in that rubble at that site. Also Saturday at a news conference, it was revealed that investigators, searchers, have found something of interest, the passport of one of the suspected hijackers. That passport somehow survived floating down from above. It was found some distance from the World Trade Center crash site itself. And at the Camp David presidential retreat, U.S. President George W. Bush met with his advisors and told Americans to brace for what may come. He said U.S. military personnel should be ready for a war. He said, quote, "We are at war." And sources are telling us now that 2 of the hijackers of the plane that crashed into the Pentagon had been under surveillance by U.S. law enforcement and intelligence circles. The reason? A link to the bombing of the USS Cole in Yemen last year. Here's Eileen O'Connor.
They booked the tickets on American Airlines Flight 77 from Washington to Los Angeles on Travelocity using a New Jersey address, mailboxes, etc. And names U.S. officials confirm were known to them: Khalid al-Midhar and Salim al-Hamzi. Once on board, together with al-Hamzi's brother and an old roommate, a known pilot, they took over the flight, crashing it into the Pentagon. Within minutes, the facade of a symbol of American strength crumbled. As the search and rescue efforts continue, sources say the FBI was informed that Khalid al-Midhar and Salim al-Hamzi were associated with Osama bin Laden and the bombing of the USS Cole. One source confirms they had concrete evidence al-Midhar had met with a man who was later involved in the attack on the Cole.
One was kind of short and the other 2 was tall.
Al-Midhar was a frequent visitor of al-Hamzi and his brother Nawak in the San Diego apartment complex.
They was always together. If they left, they was together. They come back, they together.
They hung out a lot at the pool, despite telling their neighbors they were studying at a nearby college.
You'll see 3 of them in the pool swimming, or you'll see the dude always looking out the window, another one outside the door on the phone.
At one point, they left, telling one landlord they were in Arizona, living in different cities at different addresses. As it turns out, rooming with another hijacker aboard that plane, Hani Hanjour. Hani attended this flying school, CRM, Cockpit Resource Management, but left without a certification.
He's kind of a waste of time. He wouldn't show up for flights on time, didn't do his homework.
Not a promising student, but skilled enough to carry out the mission. Eileen O'Connor, CNN, Washington.
And of course, the fact that that mission was successfully and brutally and lethally carried out raises questions, Jack. How was it possible? Nobody yet is pointing fingers of responsibility or blame, but that's going to come one day with the question, how can you account for this massive intelligence failure? A couple of facts. We have all kinds of agencies, CIA, spy satellites, Defense Department agencies. This nation spends, the figures are classified officially. You don't kind of find it in the public budget.
That may be one of the problems, yeah.
$30 billion a year.
Wow.
Is the biggest estimate. Now, those $30 billion, only about $3 billion, that's about $10 billion, this is an estimate again, goes to the CIA. Most of this going to defense-related, the high-tech, the satellites. These are NSA. These are very expensive operations. But they're designed, basically, by and large, for the old kind of war. Mm-hmm. And so some thinking is going to have to be done about where those intelligence dollars go.
Yeah, dawn of a new era. Garrick, thanks very much. Thanks for being with me on the maiden voyage. And if they let us come back tomorrow night, I'll see you then.
Okay.
Garrick Utley. Let's go to Tom Mintier. One of the very early statements out of the government in the wake of this happening was that Pakistan was going to be called upon to meet a list of requests, in quotation marks, because of their geographic proximity to Afghanistan and some other things. Those requests included changes in border restrictions, possible cutting off of fuel lines. Tom Mintier is live in Islamabad, where it is now 1:36 in the morning here in New York. Tom, what's the latest?
Well, it's the middle of the morning here, and the consensus building is continuing. You just look at the globe, and you see where Pakistan sits. It's right next to Afghanistan, and if there is going to be any kind of military operation, the piece of the puzzle that may be the most important is Pakistan. And the United States realizes this, and they called on Pakistan quite early on for their support. Now, yesterday there was a 4-hour meeting at the President's office in the Cabinet room between the Cabinet, the President, and the National Security Council. And after that meeting, they said they had consensus to help the United States combat terrorism and bring whoever perpetrated the crime in the United States to justice. What's going on today? The President is meeting with editorial writers. He's meeting with politicians. He's also meeting with religious leaders later in the day. This is part of an effort to sell the plan of helping the United States. Now, the foreign minister last night, when he briefed reporters about this consensus that was reached within the Pakistani government, talked about the UN resolutions of the Security Council, not so much the United States, saying that Pakistan would carry out its international responsibilities under the Charter of the United Nations, reminiscent of what we saw many Arab countries going up into the buildup of the Gulf War as a coalition was being built, relying on UN cover, if you will, to sell the assistance to the United States military at home. So that's apparently what's going on here. There are very important meetings if President Musharraf is to sell this plan to his people in Pakistan. The meetings that are going on now with the opinion makers, the movers and shakers in Pakistan, and the religious leaders to basically put the word out of why the assistance is being offered. So we should know later in the day, and maybe even tomorrow in the editorials in the newspapers, how effective he was in swaying their opinion and putting it into print for the public to read here. Because at first blush, yesterday when they heard that there was consensus to help the United States, there were a lot of upset people we talked to in the streets saying that this puts Pakistan out in the front. And we've already heard the threat from the Taliban that anyone who helps the United States is seen as an enemy of theirs and that they would be attacked as well. So there are some very nervous people in and out of the government in Pakistan. The government is now trying to put together consensus within the country, trying to make sure that everyone is on board the decision that the government has made. You must remember that this is not a democratically elected government. This is a military government. So there are no real divisions in the military. They're running and controlling things here. And as one government official pointed out to me very strongly, that they are all together on the same page pushing forward. U.S. President George W. Bush called the Pakistani president last night. They spoke on the phone for about 10 to 15 minutes after the decision was made by Pakistan to assist the United States. So that is the first time we know of that the U.S. president has called President Musharraf. Colin Powell has made several calls in the days leading up to this meeting yesterday, but President Bush spoke for 10 minutes to President Musharraf. So we'll have to wait and see in the coming days how this offer of assistance plays out here domestically. Jack?
Tom, thank you. One of our viewers, Tom, has a question you might be able to answer. Lisa's on the phone from Florida. Lisa, what's your question?
Hello. Well, I have a question and I have a quick comment afterwards. Now, Pakistan seems to be grudgingly agreeing to all of our requests, but at the price of economic aid. Why do we need rented allegiance like this when we can go a few miles to the north to Russia and her former satellite states, use their facilities, recruit their veterans from the Afghan war? I mean, the Russians share a lot of common ground with us. They're desperate for the money. They have a lot of the same problems that we have, and they're more likely to remain an ally as opposed to the Pakistanis. So why don't we do that as opposed to go with the Pakistanis?
That's a very good question. That's a very good question, but you do have to understand that Pakistan is one of just a couple of nations that have relations with the Taliban. The intelligence that the Pakistanis may have on the whereabouts of Osama bin Laden could be critical for any U.S. military planning. There is also the fact that the Taliban and the Pakistanis are still talking. You won't find that anywhere else. The intelligence from this side of the Afghan border is critical, and it's apparent that the Russians are on board, so you have both sides of Afghanistan basically being isolated and boxed out. While they'd like to keep the diplomatic channels open and continue to work the diplomatic efforts, the military options are being weighed and considered, and I'm sure those at the Pentagon are looking at the maps and looking at the intelligence where the centers are that they can gather the best intelligence on the Taliban and on Afghanistan and on Osama bin Laden, and Pakistan is a critical player in that. If there is to be a plan put together, Pakistan is vital. And you can see that in how quickly the Secretary of State made the reach out to Pakistan to join in. They know how critical it is, and they made the effort very early on to get Pakistan on board.
All right, Tom Mintier, thanks very much. He's live in Islamabad, Pakistan. Lisa, thank you. Major Garrett at the White House, what about this idea of Russian cooperation? Are they paying lip service to what happened in the United States, or can we count on them for something besides rhetoric?
Oh, Jack, I think the United States and President Bush and the senior advisors expect much more than rhetoric from the Russians, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One thing I'd like to share with our viewers, our State Department reporter Andrea Koppel was able to provide some information today about the scope, the international scope of the casualty list at the World Trade Center. Let me start off with one nation, Russia, 96 missing. Let's talk about some other nations as this coalition broadens out, and then I'll return to the question about Russia. The United Kingdom, 100 dead. Switzerland, 8 dead, 280 missing. India, 250 missing. Germany, 4 dead, 550 missing. Canada, 150 missing. As the United States broadens this coalition, it finds willing nations because they too have suffered this act of terrorism. Now let's get back to Russia. There are several angles here. One of them is Russia, as you may recall, has a terrorism problem of its own. Bombs have exploded in Moscow, set by Chechen rebels, have killed many dozens of Russians. Russian President Vladimir Putin is acutely aware of this, and he sees within this world revulsion at the terrorism committed against the United States an opportunity to also create the same revulsion about the terrorism that has affected his own capital, his own people. And it is the understanding of the U.S. government that as Russia provides assistance, provides aid, it will also, at least tacitly, be seeking a green light to prosecute its own internal campaign against Chechen terrorism as a way of responding to terrorism in the way the United States, no doubt, wants to respond to the act of terrorism against the United States. Tom Mintier is absolutely correct. The entire effort here is to isolate as much as possible, not only the Taliban, but Osama bin Laden. And Tom Mintier's other point about the intelligence, the human intelligence, simply cannot be underestimated. One of the problems that disabled and in many respects hamstrung President Clinton in 1998 when he was trying to respond with cruise missiles and other means to the terrorism attacks of the 2 U.S. embassies in Africa was the United States simply had no human intelligence from Pakistan because it was not provided about Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. You'll recall those cruise missiles missed their targets. There was intelligence suspecting that a camp was in fact there and that many of the Osama bin Laden followers would have been killed. Nobody in fact turned out to have been there. A huge failure of human intelligence. That's something the U.S. government believes Pakistan can provide. And so in addition to isolating Osama bin Laden, the United States government wants to, as best as it possibly can, obtain that human intelligence, which may only be available through Pakistan.
All right, thanks. Major Garrett in Washington. Let me ask our terrorism expert, Harvey Kushner, author of The Future of Terrorism. How much realistically can we depend on the Soviet Union, or Russia, not the Soviet Union anymore, for?
Jack, I think very little. I'm not sanguine about Pakistan aid either. I believe that Osama bin Laden has infiltrated Pakistan, and quite officials support him. The Chechens have infiltrated with bin Laden supporters and aid. And I think that the Russians, Putin, would rather just look at this as America's problem, give lip service to the world community, because how could he not? The same thing with the Pakistanis. They're going to do it, but can they deliver it? I wouldn't station American troops in Pakistan. I wouldn't trust them. I might want to use their airspace. I think the issue is very complex. I think, let's face it, that whole area is a powder keg. We have Iran, who would love to move in on a crippled Afghanistan, and you have also Russia. This is why the problem is immense, and at this point in time, everybody's jumping in, but when it gets hot, I don't count on the Russians for support. I wouldn't count on the Pakistani government for support as well.
Yeah, you wonder, based on history, that when the bullets start flying, who's going to be standing there alongside us to be counted.
Not only, Jack, more importantly, Peshawar, Pakistan is really the thoroughfare of the terrorists, ferrying back and forth between. That's where we picked up. That's where we picked up Ramzi Youssef in a safe house that Osama bin Laden has supported all these years.
Jerry in New Jersey, you have a question? Oh, Kelly, I'm sorry. Excuse me. That's what I said. Jerry in New Jersey.
No, it's Joey.
It's Joey. I apologize.
That's no problem.
It's very late, and
my
I'm tired.
to the families of that horrific act in the World Trade Center. But I have a question. My sister and my brother-in-law tonight came up with something. Why on airplanes can't they just have a gas to release that they can put the passengers to sleep or for an hour if in fact there's a hijacking where the pilots could go land safely somewhere?
Mary Schiavo will probably know the answer to that. Sounds like a good idea to me. I don't know I'm not a sophisticated aviation expert, but what about that? Some sort of disabling agent?
Well, that is one that I hadn't heard considered in the FAA during my tenure at the Department of Transportation, but it would work for this reason. The only people on the aircraft that have smoke hoods, that have protective breathing equipment, or PBEs, are the pilots and the flight attendants, other than passengers like myself who happen to carry their own. But literally, those would be the only people that would be protected from the gas, because passengers don't have them, and those little oxygen masks that fall from the ceiling wouldn't do a thing. So theoretically, it would work, but you'd have to make sure, the pilots and flight attendants got the PBEs on and not the hijackers. So I've never heard that one. I've heard lots of stuff, even gases for fire extinguishing, but not that one.
I'm just sitting here thinking, I wonder, too, what kind of potential liability you might encounter if you found somebody on the plane who had a sensitivity to whatever the agent was. I mean, you could get into a whole long discussion, I suppose, but it's not a bad idea.
Well, you actually did have that problem on one foreign flight where they had a very unruly passenger, and they did inject him with something to calm him down, and that passenger died. So you probably would have liability like that, but the caller said to put them to sleep. Lots of people are sensitive to it, but that is one that I can honestly say I hadn't heard discussed in the Department of Transportation.
Interesting. Adam in Kansas, what's your question?
Yeah, hey, I was wondering, with the talk of a ground war in Afghanistan that we've heard the rumors of, is the administration worried that this could turn into another Vietnam with as mountainous as terrain that the terrain is?
You know, the Russians spent 20 years in there and finally had to give up and go away. I mean, they couldn't get it done. I mean, this is arguably the toughest terrain in the world to try to fight a ground war in. What about that?
Yeah, British also as well. No, and we built the structures for the Osama to withstand Soviet carpet bombing for years.
Yeah, with the Western money financed the effort against the Russians.
Gave them Stinger missiles, which we're trying to purchase back now. No, I don't think we want to get involved in a protracted war because the country still has memory of Vietnam. And, again, America has a blessing in that philosophically we forget very easily, and sometimes ignorance is bliss. And, but in this case, I think we're in for a long, protracted war, but certainly not on the ground in Afghanistan. That would be as bad as getting into a land war down in South America with the drug trade.
Yeah, Major Garrett in Washington, one of the great fears when the current president's father, George Herbert Walker Bush, committed to going in against Saddam Hussein was that the American appetite for prosecuting a ground war would pale very quickly when the body bags began coming out. For want of a better way to phrase it, that ground war in Iraq would be a walk in the park compared to the kind of thing potentially that ground troops would get into in Afghanistan. What about that potential for simply destroying in a very short period of time, perhaps, the American will to do this thing?
Well, I think we want to be careful and not get too far ahead of ourselves. You know, there is a sense, people look at the map strategically, they talk, well, would it require ground troops? All the administration has said so far is it's not ruling out ground troops. It has never given a wink or a nod that we should prepare for ground troops. What the president has said is, I'm ruling nothing out. We should prepare for every eventuality. But we had a caller earlier asking about, are we going to try to find ways to domestically produce more textiles, more steel, more other goods associated with a 20th century type of war. And again, the president is trying to prepare all of us to understand that those kinds of thoughts, a Rosie the Riveter and a massive industrial buildup, is probably not what we're going to be encountering here, because the enemy is shadowy, elusive in many different places. And he's also saying, you know, don't think about this in a traditional military sense, and that would, I would suggest to you, perhaps argue against active contemplation of a ground war in a place distant as Afghanistan, though it's worth pointing out the administration has ruled nothing out, but I don't think it is laying the kind of groundwork yet for that. And of course, in your reference to the point about Iraq, it was very much on the minds of the president, George Herbert Walker Bush, to stay within the confines of the UN resolution and not pursue that ground war through Baghdad. There's been innumerable second guessing about that.
Yeah,
and one of the factors, of course, was, can the United States sustain the kind of casualties, politically and otherwise?
You know, there's a lot of second guessing. In hindsight, being 2020, a lot of people wondering why we didn't do more than what we did, I think, in Iraq. Tom on the phone in Connecticut, what's your question? Oh, I'm sorry, Arlene in California. What can we do for you?
Yes, hello. It's a well-known fact that people all over the world get their information from CNN. Knowing this, why do you give the specifics on passenger profiling that could be of great interest to future terrorists? And shouldn't you, as responsible journalists, exercise discretion when it comes to divulging articulate information or critical information?
That's a legitimate question. Let me just, and he doesn't need me to defend him, but let me, in context, just suggest that that comment came up in an effort to understand why our security people and the agencies charged with preventing the kind of tragedy that happened last Tuesday were unable to pick this up. And the man sitting to my left, Harvey Kushner, has been studying this stuff all his life, and I think he was trying to shed a little light on the fact that there were some signs, if we'd really been paying attention, that perhaps there were some signs. Harvey, you can...
And Jack, I wasn't giving up the profiling system, which I'm not privy to the inner workings of, but the question I asked Mary was one of the most basic things, a one-way ticket by cash.
Right.
You know, this begs the question, Jack. I just want to move back for a second. We've been looking at really the nuts and bolts of, reactive measures. I'd like to ratchet up our efforts in human intelligence. You know, we're calling this Operation Noble Eagle. Mm-hmm. We should have Operation Noble Effort and make it a noble profession once again to join the CIA, join the NSA, FBI. In other words, I want to be able to get people inside these organizations that would do us harm. So they're going to make that call prior to somebody boarding the plane. So it makes our people at the airports look good that they stopped them as they got on the plane.
Is it a legitimate criticism that we've come to rely too heavily on technical intelligence and the ability of gizmos and things?
Absolutely.
And, you know, you talk to New York City detectives, they'll tell you, you want to catch the bad guy, you got to put money in the street, and you got to be willing to associate with the bad guys. And there's no substitute for that.
Absolutely. You look at domestic crime, and I think it's the same in fighting terrorism. It's the tipster, the person, the informant, that gets the case done.
I had promised I wanted to ask you this, and we're coming up on the end of this thing. What is it that has engendered so much hatred toward the United States in that part of the world, and what, if anything, can be done about it besides going to war over there?
Jack, it's a multifaceted problem. Certainly, we could begin by the support of certain countries in that region. America's steadfast support of the State of Israel obviously is a thorn in the side of some Arab communities. America's involvement in what is perceived as the Holy Land defiling, being in Saudi Arabia. What's an irritant, particularly to Osama bin Laden, is the fact that the infidels, the United States in particular, got involved in a Muslim issue, which was the an invasion of Iraq, of Kuwait, which they view that the Kuwait was drawn by the West itself. So it's not just one particular thing, it's a whole group of things, and interestingly enough, many different groups there focus in what the irritant is, and they all come together as one thing, their hatred for the United States. It's that pot that brews continuously. It's not just the Israeli issue, it's not just being in Saudi Arabia, it's not just our involvement in the Persian Gulf War, it's the fact that within this interpretation of Islam, that technology and the West and the Western way of life is blasphemy, is an apostasy to these people. It's a whole very complicated groups of issues, and it's not just one thing.
Is it too late to get involved in some sort of proactive foreign policy in that part of the world? We are dependent on oil, perhaps because, again, of our complacency about energy problems in this country. We consume a tremendous amount of it, and a lot of it has to come from the Middle East. We are strong supporters of the Israelis in a political alliance that goes back over 50 years now. But is there something in the way of a foreign policy initiative that could be started that might begin to at least blunt the intensity, the white-hot heat of the hatred over there?
Well, we need to support, it was said before when Jeff was here earlier, that the misery, the poverty in that region precipitates this type of behavior. So obviously a foreign policy that addresses that particular issue. But we also have to understand the world is a bad neighborhood, and there's some bad people out there who want to do us harm, and we can't fight with, is it the Marcus of Queensberry rules of fair fight, roll up the sleeves or do
the gentleman's agreement.
We might have to roll back President Ford's directive not to assassinate people. I don't want to get into a policy of assassination, but I think everybody out there understands what I mean. We need covert operations sometimes to take somebody out when that's the particular issue. And we got to get that human intelligence in the ground, so we put people in the right positions in government and not necessarily despots, maybe good people, and understand that that region of the world doesn't get democracy overnight.
All right, Harvey, author of Future of Terrorism, Harvey Kushner, thank you very much for being with us tonight. It's been most interesting. I've enjoyed it.
Well, good looking your show.
And Mary Schiavo, thank you, former Department of Transportation Inspector General, author of the bestseller Flying Blind, Flying Safe. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll do this again. And mostly, thank you people for watching. This is the maiden voyage of CNN Hotline. We leave you tonight with some remarkable images of New York's firefighters. Some of the real heroes of all of this, is captured by the photographers of the Associated Press and put together by a friend and colleague of mine, Peter Viles. We caution you, some of these images are graphic, disturbing, but they are moving and very germane to what's going on. Thanks again. I'm Jack Cafferty. I think we'll see you again tomorrow night.
Chaplain Michael Judge, the New York City Fire Department chaplain, who was administering last rites to one of his own, another firefighter, when debris fell on him.
Almost every morning he would say a special prayer for peace in the city and for safety for all the visitors, because he just thought this was the greatest place in the world.
He would say to me once in a while, "You know what I really need?" "No, what, Mike?" "Absolutely nothing. I don't need a thing in the world. I am the happiest man on the face of the earth."
It was terror, sheer terror. Bodies were falling out of the sky.
Do you ever think of maybe not being a fireman anymore?
No, Mr. King, I will always be a fireman here in New York City.
In terms of the people we're looking for, it's a couple of hundred firefighters and police officers, which is a staggering number. The men and women who are doing this, when you see them doing it, they are literally putting their lives at risk to try to find people and save them.
Personally, I've lost quite a few, maybe a dozen personal friends. And it breaks my heart. They're great men. They're very great men.
Thank you for your hard work. Thank you for making the nation proud. And may God bless America.
This recovery operation is an exceedingly dangerous operation, and the men and women who are involved in it are very brave people and entitled to the admiration and respect of all of us.
Do you ever think of maybe not being a fireman anymore?
No, Mr. King, I will always be a fireman here in New York City, protecting the people of New York and my friends.